Over 2 years in the jungles of Malaya, New Zealand patrols fought 14 separate engagements, killed 15 enemy fighters, captured 1, and took the surrender of 9 more. 15. In 2 years. From a squadron of 133 men, in the field for roughly 18 of the 24 months they were in the country. Read that cold, with no context, and it looks like the most expensive failure in New Zealand military history. A brand new elite unit, recruited from over 800 volunteers, trained for months, shipped across the world, kept in the jungle for a year and a half, to kill 15 men. An accountant in Wellington in 1958 would have had questions. And that strange, tiny, awkward number is why this episode exists. 15 is not the story of a unit that failed. It's the story of a unit doing something the number cannot measure, in a war deliberately not called a war, using methods that would make this regiment one of the most respected small special forces units on Earth. Now, the title of this video, and this channel's standing contract with you. You'll find claims online about a redacted operations log from the New Zealand Special Air Service's first deployment. A document supposedly classified for 40 years, hiding what really happened in Malaya. This series has spent 11 episodes testing such claims, and the honest verdict is, no such sealed 40-year log has ever surfaced in the public record. The Malayan deployment is one of the better documented chapters of New Zealand's post-war military history. The dates, areas of operation, engagement counts, and the names of the 2 men who died are all in public sources today, without a single information request. So if you came for a smoking gun document, this episode disappoints you in 90 seconds and then repays you, because something in this story really was hidden. It just wasn't hidden in a filing cabinet. 3 things were obscured about the New Zealand Special Air Service's first deployment, and all 3 are documented. The first was the war itself. What the New Zealanders fought in was never officially a war. It was the Malayan Emergency, a name chosen not for military reasons, but commercial ones, because the rubber and tin industries that made Malaya valuable were insured for losses during civil unrest, and not for losses in a war. 12 years of jungle fighting, thousands of dead, all filed under a euphemism to keep the money moving. Every man who served fought in a conflict his own governments had agreed to call something smaller. The second was the nature of the work. The public image of special forces, then and now, is the raid, the ambush, the door kicked in. The New Zealanders' Malayan War was the opposite. Months of walking, watching, waiting beside jungle tracks that produced nothing, building relationships with the peoples of the deep interior, and denying an enemy the thing he needed most. It was tedious, exhausting, physically ruinous work, with almost nothing to show a camera. 15 kills in 2 years is not evidence that the method failed. It is evidence of what the method actually was. The third, and this is the closest thing to a genuine scandal in this story, is what New Zealand did to the squadron afterwards. Within months of coming home from 2 years in the jungle, having built from scratch a capability the British professionals rated highly, the unit was disbanded, not reduced, not rested, disbanded. Its men dispersed back into the ordinary army, its expertise treated as a requirement that had expired. New Zealand's first Special Forces squadron was erased by its own defence establishment barely 2 years after creation. Then, in 1959, quietly recreated, because the country needed it after all. That is the redaction in this story. Not ink on a page. An institution deciding that what it had learned wasn't worth keeping and having to buy the lesson twice. So here's where the next 4 chapters go. 1955, and the act of national improvisation that produced this squadron. A government decision in February, over 800 volunteers, a selection that took barely a fifth of them, a commander named Frank Rennie building a unit from nothing, and a departure in November for a war nobody was calling a war. Then into the jungle itself, Fort Brooke, on the border of Perak and Kelantan, from April 1956, and the reality of deep patrol soldiering in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, alongside the Iban trackers of Borneo, whose bushcraft the New Zealanders studied like apprentices. Then the numbers, decoded, what 15 engagements actually cost, how the squadron's 2 dead men died, neither of them in the way the folklore would prefer, and why the metric that mattered was never the body count. And finally the disbandment, the resurrection, and the inheritance, the direct line from 133 men in the Malayan jungle to everything this series has documented since. It starts in an office in Wellington in February 1955, with a small country working out that it could no longer afford to be an ordinary one. In February 1955, the New Zealand government made a decision that would still be paying dividends 70 years later, and it made it for the least romantic reason imaginable: money. New Zealand was expected to contribute to the Far East Strategic Reserve and Britain's counter-insurgency campaign in Malaya. It could send a battalion, hundreds of men, with all the shipping and expense that drags behind, or something small, sharp, and disproportionately useful. The decision was to raise a squadron modelled on the British Special Air Service, an effective and economic contribution in the language of the time. That phrase is the founding logic of everything this channel has documented across 11 episodes. New Zealand's special forces exist because a small country did the arithmetic and concluded quality was the only affordable influence. The job of building it went to Major Frank Rennie, and it was, quite literally, building from nothing. There was no New Zealand Special Forces tradition to inherit, no depot, no selection course, no doctrine, no instructors. There was a name borrowed from the British, a requirement, and a deadline. What happened next tells you something about New Zealand in the mid-1950s. The call went out, and more than 800 men volunteered. Look at who they were, because it's among the most underappreciated facts in the regiment's history. Of the 182 selected for training from June 1955, roughly 138 were civilians, not serving soldiers, farm workers, tradesmen, labourers, clerks, men from the back country and small towns, walking in off the street to volunteer for a unit that did not yet exist, to fight somewhere most could not have found on a map, in a conflict their government called an emergency. That civilian majority shaped the squadron permanently. These were not career soldiers steeped in parade ground habit, but practical outdoorsmen from a country where hunting, tramping, bush navigation, and improvisation were ordinary weekend competencies. Men who arrived knowing how to live outside, needing to be taught soldiering rather than self-reliance. It's precisely the inheritance this series traced in the German respect for New Zealand infantry a decade earlier, and it would run forward through jungle, desert, and mountain for the next 70 years. Selection stripped 800 down to 182, and training stripped further. The squadron that eventually deployed numbered around 133 men. On the 20th of November 1955, the squadron left New Zealand. They did not go straight into the jungle. First came Changi in Singapore and parachute training, because the British Special Air Service of that era inserted into jungle by parachute, a technique called tree jumping that is exactly as alarming as it sounds. Descending deliberately into the canopy, trusting the branches to catch your parachute, then abseiling down whatever height remained to the jungle floor. Men were injured doing this in training and on operations. By any modern standard, it was an insane way to enter a battlefield, and it was routine. Then came the jungle itself, in the mountains of Perak, where the New Zealanders were taught the environment before they were allowed to fight in it, and where the squadron met the teachers who would shape it most, the Iban. Among the assets attached to the campaign were Iban trackers from Sarawak, in Borneo, men from a culture in which reading the forest was not a military skill, but a way of being alive in the world. The Sarawak Rangers supplied them to Commonwealth forces throughout the emergency, and New Zealand's own specialist tracking element eventually included around 25 New Zealanders, 23 Iban trackers, and a detail that says everything about the strangeness of this war: 3 surrendered enemy fighters, working for the side that had captured them. Consider that apprenticeship, not classroom instruction, but weeks walking behind a man who could look at a bent stem and tell you how many passed, how long ago, how heavily loaded, whether they were tired, who distinguished yesterday's footprint from this morning's by the condition of the crushed leaf inside it, and read the forest floor as continuous text. New Zealand soldiers arrived competent in their own bush. They left having been trained by the best trackers in the world. And that inheritance, tracking and counter-tracking and signature discipline, became permanent regimental DNA, visible in every campaign this series has covered. Understand also what they had been sent to fight. The Malayan National Liberation Army was a communist insurgency, largely drawn from the Malayan Chinese population, dug into the jungle interior in camps and cultivation areas. It survived on a supply network, the Min-UN, that provided food, information, and recruits. And critically, some of its units had retreated so deep into the interior that they had begun living among, and depending upon, the Orang Asli, the indigenous peoples of the Malayan highlands. That dependency was the enemy's centre of gravity, and the reason the New Zealand squadron would spend a year and a half doing something that produced almost no kills at all. In April 1956, the squadron was sent to the place where that logic was sharpest. Fort Brooke, on the border of Perak and Kelantan, deep in the interior, at the far end of everything and everyone. From the 2nd of April 1956, the New Zealand squadron operated in the Fort Brooke area, on the mountainous border between Perak and Kelantan. And to understand what that meant, you have to abandon almost everything the word operation suggests. No front lines, no roads, no relief at the end of a shift. Fort Brooke was a jungle fort in the deep interior, and the country around it was primary rainforest on steep, broken ground. Triple canopy that turned midday into dusk. Ridges that took hours to climb and minutes to lose. Rivers that were both the only highways and the loudest places to be. Leeches took blood in quantities the men, measured in socks. Wet boots meant rotting feet. Everything you carried until you left, and patrols went out for weeks. The squadron spent roughly 18 of its 24 months in Malaya operating in the jungle. Sit with that ratio. Not 18 months in the country, 18 months in the trees. For most soldiers in most wars, the front is a place you visit. For these men, the jungle was the address. The daily work was the inverse of the special forces image. A patrol inserted, on foot from a fort, by river, sometimes by tree-jumping parachute descent, then moved at the pace this series has documented in every New Zealand campaign since. Slowly, silently, reading ground. Days would be spent covering distances a fit man could walk in an hour on a road. The patrol would find a track, a river crossing, or the edge of a cultivation clearing, then stop and do the hardest thing in soldiering. Nothing at all, for as long as it took. Lying in ambush through the night, and the next, and the one after. Recording who came, and when, and with what. Most of the time, nobody came at all. That is not a failure of the technique. That is the technique. And it explains the strange number this episode opened with. But the deepest part of the Malayan mission wasn't ambushing at all. It was the contest for the Orang Asli. The communist units that had retreated furthest into the interior had a supply problem no jungle can solve. Rice. Men cannot live in the rainforest. Deep jungle groups survived by cultivating hidden gardens, and above all by drawing food, porters and information from the Orang Asli. Peoples who had lived in that interior for millennia, and who had excellent historical reasons to distrust any outsider arriving up the rivers with a rifle and a request. The Commonwealth answer, refined across the emergency, was to compete for that relationship rather than attack it. Jungle forts were established in the interior, Fort Brooke among them, bringing medical treatment, trade goods and salt to communities with almost no access to any of it, and offering protection from a guerrilla movement that simply took what it needed. Soldiers learned to sit for hours in longhouses, to accept food, to treat sickness, to ask, and to listen, and to keep coming back. For the New Zealanders, this was the war. Patrol, watch, ambush, and talk. Cut the enemy off from rice and eyes, and the jungle does the rest. An insurgent who cannot resupply must either come out where he can be caught or starve inward into irrelevance. Every surrender the squadron accepted, and it accepted 9, was, in a sense, the harvest of that patient strangulation. 9 men who walked in and gave up, because the alternative had become unbearable. Now, this series does not do propaganda, so 2 honest qualifications belong here. The first is that the wider emergency contained hard measures no modern account should skip. Mass resettlement of hundreds of thousands of rural Chinese into guarded new villages, food denial operations that pressed heavily on civilians, detention and deportation, New Zealand's. The squadron was one small element inside a British-run campaign that used those instruments. The counterinsurgency historians later praised as a rare success also involved coercion at scale. The hearts and minds story is real, and it sits inside a rougher structure. The second is that the enemy was a real fighting force. The Malayan National Liberation Army had fought the Japanese occupation only years earlier, some of its men trained and armed by the British themselves. Whatever the era's terminology, these were not bandits. They were experienced jungle fighters on ground they knew, and their skills were why Commonwealth forces had to build units like this squadron at all. Then, in late 1956, the squadron shifted south to a different problem. Negri Sembilan, the mountainous country between Seremban, Kuala Pila, and Tampin. Different terrain, closer to populated country, The same patient methodology. More patrols, more ambushes that produced nothing, more weeks in the wet. Somewhere in those months, the New Zealand Special Air Service stopped being a hasty experiment and became a professional special forces unit, measured not by what it destroyed, but by the fact that 22 SAS, the most experienced jungle special forces organization on Earth, treated the New Zealanders as an equal squadron of its own regiment. And it cost. 14 contacts across 2 years sounds like very little violence, and in one sense, it was. But it was not nothing, and 2 of these men never came home. Now let's open the ledger properly, because the numbers in this deployment are the most misunderstood thing about it. 2 years, 14 separate engagements, 15 enemies were killed, 1 captured, 9 surrenders taken. Start with the engagements, not the kills. 14 contacts in 24 months means the squadron fought, on average, once every 7 or 8 weeks. Every other day of those 2 years, hundreds upon hundreds of days, were spent walking, watching, waiting, and finding nothing. That is the true texture of the deployment. Overwhelmingly, these men were not fighting. They were searching, in conditions that punished them relentlessly whether or not anyone was there to shoot at. Then look at the kills against the surrenders. 15 killed, 9 surrendered, 1 captured. 25 enemy fighters were removed from the war, and 10 of them, 40%, taken alive. In a counterinsurgency, that ratio is not a footnote, it's the scoreboard. A dead guerrilla is a body. A surrendered one is an intelligence source, a propaganda asset, and sometimes, as the squadron's own tracker unit showed, with 3 former enemy fighters serving in it. A recruit. The emergency was ultimately won, not by killing every insurgent, but by making the insurgency an unlivable career, and every surrender was proof of that pressure. Now hold the 15 against the alternative. Had New Zealand sent a battalion instead, the other option Wellington considered in 1955, those men would have swept, cordoned, and searched. Noisy operations that push guerrillas around a map rather than removing them at enormously greater cost. The squadron's 15 were not a small return on a big effort. They were a small return on a small effort, achieved in the deepest terrain, in a role no conventional unit could have filled. 15 is what happens when 130 men spend 2 years denying an enemy the ability to move, rather than chasing him. And there is one number that matters more than any of these. Though it never appears on a scoreboard, the squadron's own death. 2 men. Trooper A.R. Thomas was fatally wounded on patrol on the 2nd of May 1956, 5 weeks into the Fort Brooke operations. Corporal A.G. Buchanan died of heat stroke on patrol on the 11th of May 1957. Look at those 2 deaths honestly, because they tell you what this war actually was. Neither man was killed storming a position. One was shot on a routine patrol in a contact that lasted moments and produced no headline. The other was killed by the jungle itself, by heat, exertion, and a body that finally could not shed the temperature it was carrying. Heat stroke is not an incidental way to die in that country. It is one of the environment's primary weapons, and it kills fit, determined men precisely because they are fit and determined enough to keep going when they should stop. Corporal Buchanan died doing exactly what the squadron did every day, carrying a load through heat in dense country, on patrol for as long as it took. If you wanted one detail to explain why 15 understates this deployment, It is this. A New Zealand soldier died on the walk. Not the fighting, the walking. 2 deaths out of roughly 133 across 2 years in that environment is also, and this deserves saying, a remarkably low toll. And it wasn't luck. It was the product of the discipline this series keeps documenting. The slow movement, the noise control, the tracking skill, the refusal to be found. In a war where being detected first was usually fatal, the squadron's ability to remain unseen was not just an operational technique, it was a casualty prevention system. By late 1957, the tour was ending. The squadron came home to a New Zealand that had barely noticed it left. And here is where the disparity between what these men had built and what their country understood becomes almost painful. They had done something no New Zealand unit had done before, created a special forces capability from scratch, taken it to a foreign jungle, operated it under the most experienced special forces regiment in the world for 2 years, and brought it back, with its reputation made. Their British parent regiment knew exactly what they were worth. The Iban trackers who had taught them knew. The surrendered enemy fighters knew. Back home, they had fought in a conflict called an emergency, in a country most New Zealanders could not place, with a body count that looked like nothing on a page, and no photographs, no dispatches, no war correspondence, no public engagement with any of it. The Malayan emergency remains one of the least remembered campaigns in New Zealand's military history, despite involvement in Malaya and later Borneo running well over a decade. So when the folklore claims the record was classified for 40 years, it is reaching, clumsily, but for something real. The New Zealand Special Air Service's first deployment wasn't hidden by a stamp. It was hidden by indifference, distance, and a war that nobody at home could picture. And within months of the squadron's return, New Zealand's defence establishment did something that makes the neglect official, and, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible. It shut the whole thing down. In late 1957, soon after the squadron came home, the New Zealand Special Air Service was disbanded. Not stood down for reorganisation, disbanded. The rationale was administratively coherent. New Zealand's commitment in Malaya was being met instead by an infantry battalion of the New Zealand Regiment, so the Special Forces Squadron was surplus to the requirement it had been raised for. The requirement expired. The unit expired with it. Consider what that meant in practice. Over 800 men had volunteered, 182 had been selected, 133 had deployed, 2 had died. Those survivors had spent 18 months in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, learning tracking from the Iban, mastering deep patrol discipline, absorbing hard-won lessons about jungle navigation, ambushing, resupply, casualty evacuation, and the delicate business of winning over people whose trust decided the campaign. All of that lived in perhaps 130 heads, and in the working habits of a unit. New Zealand switched the unit off and sent the heads back to their battalions. 2 years later, in 1959, the New Zealand Special Air Service was reformed, and it has existed continuously ever since, through Borneo, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and every campaign this series has documented, which tells you the disbandment was not a judgment that the capability was worthless. It was a judgment that it could be switched on and off like a light. That is the classic error of small defence establishments, treating expertise as a stock item rather than a living culture, and discovering that, when you need it back, You cannot simply order more. So here, at the end of 12 episodes, is the honest verdict on this video's title. Was there a redacted operations log classified for 40 years? Not in any form the public record supports. The dates, areas, engagement counts, casualty names, and unit history of the New Zealand Special Air Service's first deployment are documented and publicly available. If a specific sealed log exists somewhere in an archive, no one has produced it, and this channel will not manufacture one to fill a title. But was something lost for decades? Absolutely. And this is the part worth taking away. What was lost was the meaning of the deployment. For decades, New Zealand's first Special Forces campaign sat in the national memory as a curiosity. A small unit, an obscure emergency, a body count too low to impress anyone, in a country nobody could picture. The emergency's own name buried it. The absence of correspondence buried it. The disbandment buried it. And a public that measured wars by casualty lists and famous battles had no framework for a campaign whose entire achievement was that very little visibly happened. Only later, as Borneo, then Vietnam, then the modern deployments unfolded, did the shape of what those men built become obvious. Every capability this channel has documented across a year of episodes traces back to that jungle. The tracking and counter-tracking of the Vietnam-era patrols. I learned from the Iban in Malaya, the signature discipline that made later patrols effectively unfindable. Malaya, the patience, the willingness to move at a crawl, lie still for days, and accept that the absence of contact is a result rather than a failure. Malaya, the habit of treating local populations as the decisive terrain rather than background scenery. The instinct behind the soft hat patrols of Bamyan half a century later. Malaya in the longhouses around Fort Brooke. And the culture itself, 800 volunteers, 138 of them civilians, a unit built from scratch by a country that could not afford a big army and decided to buy a good one instead. That founding logic is why a nation of a few million ended up with a regiment the Americans put a presidential unit citation on, that the British trained alongside as equals, and that the Taliban could not pattern. None of that was secret. All of it was invisible, which is not the same thing, and is, in some ways, worse, because secrets get declassified, and invisibility just persists until somebody decides to look. That's the closing thought this series will leave you with, 12 stories in. Across every episode, the same shape kept appearing from different directions. The fake quotes attached to real reputations. The battles fought competently and reported badly. The inquiries that reached certainty without evidence. The files sealed. The reports edited. The stories censored. And underneath all of it, the same small country doing careful, unglamorous, extraordinarily skilled work. And being remembered, when it was remembered at all, through somebody else's summary. The men of the first squadron are nearly all gone now. Trooper Thomas and Corporal Buchanan never came home at all. What they left behind isn't a redacted log. It's a regiment, and every soldier in it, 70 years later, still moves through hard country the way the Iban taught 130 New Zealanders to move. In a war their own country called an emergency, and then, for a long time, forgot. That, in the end, is what was classified. Not by a censor's stamp, by silence. And the only cure for that has always been the same. Go and read the record and say out loud what's in it.